So I got these from Facebook Marketplace for $40. There's actually one more, but I'm only going to be painting these two. So I figured it would be a perfect example of how I go about flipping furniture, because these are a weird texture. They're not real wood. I'll walk you through everything that I do to paint these until the very end. I'm going to first use Simple Clean, a rag, clean these down. They're incredibly dirty. They've been sitting in my garage for a couple of months waiting for me to work on them. So we just have to get off that dust and any type of grease residue that's on there so that our paint and primer will have something to adhere to really well and it doesn't adhere to that grease or dust. So let's get started. While I'm cleaning, I also like to take the time to investigate what needs to be repaired on the furniture. These things are pretty plasticky. Not a ton of things need to be repaired, but when I flip them over, I will be removing those wheels off there because I don't want them on wheels in my son's bedroom, just because I want it to be a little lower for his new bed that I built him. But on any other piece of furniture, this is where you're kind of seeing where veneer needs repaired. Any type of wood filler that needs to be done. I typically like to prime before I actually do the repairs, but this is a good way to really get your hands on the piece of furniture and see what you're working with. During the prep step, I also remove all the hardware because you don't want to get any paint on it. And in this case, I also want to spray paint the hardware. So I'm removing all of it and I put it in a baggie so I don't lose it all, especially on these pieces. There are so much hardware, including the hinges, the door handles, and everything else that you see. So it's important that I don't lose them. So I keep them in a nice sandwich baggie. And once all of the hardware is finally removed, it's time to sand the piece. Now this step is important because it is going to create a good surface for your paint to stick to. I use 220 grit sandpaper because it will still rough up the surface, but still keep it nice and smooth so that none of those texture marks from sanding shows through your paint. Because this isn't real wood and I'm not going to be staining the piece because I can't, I just need to quickly go over the area. Scuff sanding is generally a pretty quick process. It doesn't take long to rough up the surface enough to apply your primer. You'll see the texture difference already on this created by sanding. This is exactly what you are looking for when you're prepping this type of material. Unfortunately, the MDF that this piece is built from has bubbled just from cleaning it. Anytime MDF comes into contact with water, it swells like this, but don't worry, it can be fixed. But this is also where my design plan changes from what I originally intended. When flipping furniture, this happens about 80% of the time in terms of your design having to change based on what the furniture is giving you to work with. So to fix this, I would sand it until it's flat with the other surface and then prime it in a special primer that I will share with you. However, I'm actually going to be attaching a piece of wood over the shelf to hide the damage, but also give the shelves a more durable surface because it's going into my son's room and I know he's going to be pretty rough on it regardless. My original design plan was to just paint this shelf, and if I were to still do that, I would just sand it smooth, like I said, until it's very flat. So the full surface, you don't see any bubbling, and then I would take a primer to it, a special primer again that I will share with you, and then paint it. It's as simple as that, really. So I removed that edge banding there because I thought I was going to make this look like a flat wood shelf. So I was going to do some wood banding there, but that piece actually shows through on the outside. So I want it to be black. So instead I put that piece back on and just removed that magnet piece there that helps the door stay closed because I'm going to be putting a wood piece down and then I will reattach it. And after I finish scuff sanding, it is ready for a primer. So because this is made out of laminate and MDF, so it's made out of like a plastic material on top of MDF, and you saw that there's a lot of MDF exposure, my favorite type of primer to use when there's exposed MDF and it's like fuzzy, you see the fuzziness of MDF, is this Rust-Oleum Automotive primer, and it's a filler primer. What that means is it gets into those small crevices of the MDF and it fills them, so it's a nice sealed surface for your paint to go over and there won't be any more water damage. So this is a great primer to use, and it's inexpensive and easy to use because it's in a spray can. So highly recommend this. The other thing that you can use that I've already talked about in my previous videos is the Ben Shellac. This is a great primer to seal the exposed MDF as well. I use a roller, just like that picture, and apply it that way. But because there's so much exposed MDF, I am actually going to be using this. So before I use the primer, I use a tack cloth to wipe off all of the dust, because your primer will not adhere well if you have particles on the surface. And this, it feels sticky. You'll feel that stickiness when you open it, but it really gets all of the dust better than any other cloth that I have used. So highly recommend these two. So after wiping down the full piece to ensure there is no dust, I grab my face mask and begin spraying the paint. The other great thing about this primer is that it dries really fast and the coverage is actually really great. I only used 1 can per nightstand. The other great thing about using a spray can is that it's so easy to spray inside those little cubbies. And I also sprayed the back just to make it more seamless. Now that we've primed it, we can see the imperfections that we need to fix, and they're pretty small. So I'm actually going to be using Bondo, but just a different form of Bondo. This is the glazing and spot putty. It's great for small nicks, not the big gouges. If you have big gouges and big areas to fill, you need to get the 2-part Bondo epoxy, mix it up together, fill in those areas. You can just follow the instructions on the can. It's super easy to use. It dries really fast too, so does this stuff, and then you just sand it smooth. I typically use about 180 or 220 grit to sand smooth. I will treat this the same way that I would the Bondo. This is just easier to use because I don't have to mix it up. I am going to fill in those areas with this and wait for it to dry and then sand it smooth. You can tell that the exposed MDF still needs to be filled to ensure it's a smooth surface before painting it. Bondo all-purpose putty would do a great job at filling this in, but I'm just going to leave it because I'm covering it up with wood and there's no reason to really fix this if it's not going to be shown. Using the spot putty, I just grab some latex gloves and wipe over and kind of push in the putty so that all those little small gaps and nicks are filled. It only takes about 20 minutes or so for it to dry. Then I grab 220 grit sandpaper again and sand it nice and smooth. And don't worry if some of the primer comes off with it, because what I like to do is take some more primer in a spray can and just do that spot priming that I talked about earlier. And you don't have to prime the whole piece again, just those small areas where maybe the paint came off when you were sanding. So you can tell that I did some white touch-up spots after I had sanded that Bondo off, and that's because it's white because I ran out of the Rust-Oleum and I just used an oil-based primer, which I've talked to you also about in a former video, and I just kind of did a spot treatment on those areas. So now I am going to take 400 grit sandpaper and sand it nice and smooth before I do my first coat of paint. And that's just to get a really smooth surface. I don't spend a ton of time doing it. It's really just to knock off any maybe bumps or texture that has come with the primer. Super easy. And I don't actually even use a sanding block sometimes. I'll just fold it over in half and sand it like that. And after I'm done sanding it with that high grit sandpaper, it is time for paint. So I am going to be painting these nightstands with just a paintbrush. and my favorite 3/8 inch microfiber roller. Makes such a smooth finish. Highly recommend these. I got these at Home Depot, but I also order 3/8 inch nap rollers off of Amazon in bulk because I use them a lot. So I'll link them both below. I'm using Wise Owl 1 Hour enamel paint in the color Jet Black for the first time. It has really fast dry time of only an hour, and it's supposed to cure really fast too. I start by edging in on the sides with a brush and then use a roller on everything else. You can tell that this will need at least 3 coats to ensure it has a nice even coverage. Painting inside these cubbies can be a little difficult, just kind of annoying actually. So I like to cut in with a brush and then sometimes just kind of slap the paint on first, like you see me doing here, and then going back with a roller. It smooths it out, even though again that coverage is light and will require at least 2 more coats. So after the first coat, I like to wrap up my brush and my roller in foil just to keep it nice and moist in between coats. And then once it's time for that second coat, they are ready to go. And I just follow the same process as I did with the first coat. After the first coat, I didn't feel the need to sand afterwards, but after the second coat, I definitely did. So I grabbed 400 grit sandpaper and just lightly sanded it. I had a paint glob that I missed before, so you could see where I kind of took that off, wiped it down with the tack cloth to get all that dust off, and then just gave it that final bit of coat. And because this paint is ultra durable, I did not need to put a top coat on, and it passed the scratch test perfectly. There are no marks. This paint is seriously one of the best and most durable that I have ever used before, so I highly recommend it. It has a great sheen to it, and the final result is just beautiful.